Welcome back, everybody. Welcome to Figure It Audi. If this is the first time you're joining, hi, my name is Steve. You can also find me on Instagram at Figure It Audi, and I really didn't think I was going to go back under a car so soon after working on the S4 exhaust project.
What did he say?
But here we are, and this is not one of those YouTube tropes. This is definitely the situation where this is my wife's car. She has to go to work on Monday. It is Saturday at about 11 a.m. right now, and I have half a day plus tomorrow to get an entire project done. So here's the current situation. This car is a 2009 Audi A4, 2-liter with the turbo, and it's got the 6-speed automatic. It's the pre-facelift, and the car has about 180,000 kilometers. I'm like the 4th or 5th owner, and to my records, this car's never had a gear oil change, and I'm feeling some negative symptoms right now, I think because of that. So what I'm experiencing is that as it automatically shifts down, as I'm slowing down from 3rd to 2nd, I feel a little bit of a clunk, which is actually probably more like a transmission mount, which we'll be doing anyways. But then also it seems to sort of slip on the way up between 2nd and 3rd as well. And that again could be just like a cold gear oil type of thing, but it's getting a little bit worse, and clearly it's just time to do some stuff. What's really handy is that I'm gonna do some modifications on the way out of this gear oil change and add a couple of other things too, because it's all localized in one area. Quite truly, you have your X-brace at the bottom, which we're gonna change. Then it goes up to where a mount insert would be, which we're gonna do from 034 Motorsport. And then the transmission mount itself, also from 03 Motorsport, and then up into the automatic transmission, which has its own fluid, but there's also a center differential right in front of it that takes some verified unicorn juice, but only 1 liter, thankfully. So we'll be doing that, and then I'll run to the back in the meantime and do the rear diff as well. So I'm just gonna kind of do everything in one area. And because I have the tools and software, and because I care, we're gonna be doing the proper VCDS check for the final automatic transmission fluid level check and top off, because it is a really important step. Seems like people kind of get away without doing it, or sort of like a hacky version of it, but let's try our best. I'll show you what you can do. Last, because I am in a time crunch, but also it's really hard to film under a car if you don't have a full 2-post lift where the car's like 7 feet in the air. I'm gonna be using lots of other materials because truthfully, all the things that I'm gonna do are already pretty well documented online. I'm just sort of consolidating it for you here in this video. So I'm gonna use a lot of reference images and do some voiceover here because you don't need to see some shitty camera work under a car. Before we get going, just a quick look at all the materials we're gonna be burning through today. We have 6 liters of the ZF brand Lifeguard Fluid 8. That'll be going into the transmission. And we have the $60 gasket. That's going to be going up under the pan there. We've got the 03 Motorsport mount and insert. We've got our transmission filter. I have a whole shoebox here basically full of fresh hardware. I always like to do brand new hardware in everything because of the rust on the cars from where I'm from. But also it's just really nice to have fresh stretch bolts and all that good stuff because you're trying to be a good boy and make things not back out later, right? I've got a little bit of hypoid gear oil that's going to be going back in the rear diff. This is the unicorn juice. There might be some aftermarket options for this, but this is basically the thing you can't avoid. You only need about 1 liter of it, and it's about $100+ a liter, so you don't want much more than that. ECS Tuning X-brace, I have it here in black anodized aluminum. And that is pretty much all we're going to be doing today. Sit rep, the car is of course in the air right now. You're going to need some good working room under there. I'm using my quick jacks as I typically do. Nice little mat to keep my knees from bruising as I'm crawling around under there today. And the front and middle belly pans are off. So off we go to remove the X-brace. For 2009 to 2010 A4 and S4s, remove the 10mm nut holding the power steering cooler line to the top of the factory brace. For 2011 onwards, there are 2 plastic clips doing this job. Remove the 6 18mm bolts, which may require using a long breaker bar, and whatever method saves you from dropping the brace on your head. Note that some cars may have 2 triple square bolts, so ensure you have a set of those sockets beforehand. Now you should be looking at something like this. Hopefully yours isn't as rusty as mine, but ultimately it's steel, it's stamped, meaning it's sort of curved, but it's not solid. And it's a lot more flimsy than a full billet aluminum piece. And again, it's one of those things where if you were to rebuy this from the factory, it's just going to be more expensive than the upgrade, so you may as well do it. Now I want to call out the hardware. Mine came out somewhat easily, but it's kind of a unique design because these little pucks here, they sit up inside of little pockets in the lower part of the control arms and the subframe, and that's what you're actually threading into. So these are both the bolts and the accepting holes, of course, are M12 by 1.5 thread pitch. I think it's always a great idea to take a die, if you have a tap and die set, and actually run it down on your new hardware. You would be surprised how much their little kind of pieces of the thread from the factory still aren't clean. So I always run it down, make sure it's really, really good. And I'm actually gonna take my tap and run it through the little blocks too to make sure when my new stuff goes in and I torque it down to yield, everything is gonna be hunky-dory. Something really specific to the A4 to call out is that these ECS tuning brackets were actually designed for the S4 B8. I know that the pickup points where the bolts are pretty much the same, but you'll run into a very small and specific problem with the rubber bushing that's supposed to hold your power steering cooling line that comes back on the A4. Technically, it's like floating in the middle of nowhere on this brace. So I'm gonna have to track that line back and take the P-clamp and just move it further up where I can probably tap a hole and put a little stud and a nut onto to still hold it down in place. But other than that, it should be a bolt-up affair. With one minor exception, and that is the 6 bolts that ECS Tuning provides with the X-brace. They're actually a little bit longer than the ones that come out, at least for the A4. Again, I think we're running into an A4 versus S4 B8 situation here. But because of that, 2 of the 6 of them actually bottom out a little bit early inside of the lower control arms. They don't have a hole to actually pass the top of this through like the other 4 do. So simply all I'm going to do is take my 1/2-inch drill bit and I'm gonna run it up there and I'm gonna create a little bit of clearance because there's nothing really above it. It's just more aluminum. I'm not gonna weaken anything. It's not a big deal. And I'll just provide that clearance for myself. But that is all future install for Steve problems. For now, we actually just need to get back under the car and take more stuff apart and work our way towards the transmission fluid change. Go ahead and take a jack, get it under the car facing out the back and just put a little bit of supporting pressure on the back part of the transmission where it meets up to the drive shaft because we're about to take off a bunch of things that's gonna loosen up the transmission a bit. First, remove the 2 10mm triple square bolts circled in green and remove the plate that comes with them. Then take out the 4 12mm triple square bolts holding the cross member up to the chassis, circled in red. Last, without dropping the cross member on your face, remove the 3 13mm nuts holding the member up to the transmission bracket. Next, remove the 3 10mm triple squares holding the bracket to the transmission, and when it's off, remove the 13mm nut on the top holding the transmission mount in place. Finally, flip over the mount and use an impact to torque off the last 13mm nut holding the bottom of the mount to its bracket. Alright, you should be looking at a nice little pile of parts now. Transmission bracket and the cross member brace. Mine's pretty greasy. I'm going to hit it with some degreaser tonight and clean it up before I actually start reinstalling things. And I always take the opportunity to get my pick in there and scrape out all that dead weight of sand and grit in there. Just makes for the install a lot nicer. Of some other interest, my transmission mount was not a problem. There are no cracks in here. Certainly it's worn. I think this is the original one, but this was not my clunk. Regardless, the new mount will feel quite a bit better and a little stiffer too. This is the street durometer from 034 Motorsport, but really what I think is going to be happening is it's the spaces that were inside of the mount that hold up the transmission mount. See those big air gaps in there? Well, we're going to fill it up later with this guy right here. And I think maybe I was feeling the effects of worn rubber in here, and this was just shifting a lot when the momentum was changing. We'll see later though. Time to get under the car and do some fluid work finally. And we're going to start with the center diff. It's actually just behind towards the back of the car from the automatic transmission. And it's teeny tiny. That's why it only takes about 1 liter of fluid. Thank God, because this stuff, like I said, is over $100 US a liter. So 1 is fine in my opinion. And remember the old rule of thumb, make sure you can open your fill plugs before your drain plugs. So I'll go under there for a second. It's a bit inevitable in this episode. I do have to do some filming under there to show you some things. So let's go under and get to work. Looking towards the back of the car. And yes, I know this isn't the right way to hold up the transmission. This is just for YouTube purposes. This is for me to show you things more clearly. Definitely do as I say, don't do as I do situation. Look up here in the back on the passenger side. This is the fill hole. It is an 8mm hex head to take out and get a breaker bar for that one. It's going to be a little tough. The bottom one is right here, 6mm. Looks like it's almost hidden, like it's a structural bolt or something. No, that's your drain. So pop that one out, drain it out. Let's see what you get. To make our lives a little easier filling up with this $100 unicorn juice is this pump from Performance Tool. I'll put the Amazon link to this item in the description of the video. Note though, it's for quart and gallon size, and that's a problem because what we're going to be dealing with here and what you'll likely run into is that these are liters, as are the other sizes of fluids that we're going to do later. If you were a bit ingenious, you could actually probably retrofit the existing liter lid because the threads on the inside are a little bit different. And I bet you anything you could jam the pump body into that and solve all your problems. Doesn't matter, you can actually thread it down just a little bit, you'll survive. I have my own length of 1/4 inch hose on here because this is not going to reach up to the top of the diff from the ground because I want to be lazy. So I'll feed this in, cut it to length, and let's fill this sucker up. That really isn't too bad of a job. The little pumper thing on top of the bottle, even though it doesn't fit, works good enough to get the job done. It's better than trying to gravity fill it or something else. Anyways, beforehand I actually weighed the ounces, like ounces, not fluid ounces, of the oil in the 1 liter bottle going in, and also how much I got out into my drain pan. And long story short, I took out a little over 23 and I just put in a little over 25. So seemingly was filling or spilling out of the fill hole, meaning it was full, and I got 2 ounces more than there ever was before. So I'm done, and you can go ahead and put the drain plug back in at 12 Newton meters and the fill plug back in at 27. Something ridiculous just happened that I've never experienced, never even heard of before, which is the head of my drain plug actually just sheared right off on my socket when I was putting down the torque. I didn't even make it to those 12 Newton meters. I don't know why it just broke, but the body is still stuck up into the diff and it's holding back most of the fluid, but it's slowly dripping. So I'm gonna have to actually take that body part out, recollect my fluid, put it away on the side. Tomorrow, no part stores are gonna be open, so I'll have to figure that one out as I go here and move on to the transmission fluid. Back under the car. This time, the back of the car is to your right, just for your orientation. Now, there's a couple of confusing things back here. You might think that this is the drain plug. It's not. This is actually the fill plug. And you might think that this is the fill plug. It's actually not. It's maybe a breather, if anything, but it's kind of non-purposeful. Truthfully, your drain is up at the front, so it's really important to make sure that the car is at the very least level, if not maybe even pitched a little forward. That's what I have right now, but level is important later for when we do the proper fill and check. So what we actually want to do right now is I'm going to crack this top one just as a breather so that when I pop open the drain, it's not going to glug. I'll have the oil come out nice and even. And in order of size, this is a metric 5, fill is 10, breather 8. If you're at home only doing a transmission fluid change, skip ahead a couple of chapters to something that says transmission fluid refill. But for those of you who want to go ahead and change the filter like I am, what we need to do now is drop all the little T27 Torx bolts that are holding the pan up to the transmission, and then we'll pull down the filter that's stuck up into it. Although there is very little torque applied to the pan bolts, I still managed to strip the head of one. Thanks to the SA project though, I'm fully equipped with extraction bits, so after drilling out the center of the bolt, I was easily able to set the reverse thread extractor and back out the bolt. I had the best intentions of dropping the pan straight down, but then I absolutely bungled it, sending no less than a liter onto the floor. Wow, this has really become just one of those random projects that really tries your patience. That is by far the biggest oil spill I've done. I sort of just like lost balance and pitched out the back, even though I have a huge drip pan ready to catch everything that was coming down. I just like sent it right onto the floor. I just lost like an hour cleaning that up. But anyways, it is getting late, but I am at the point where I get to put the new filter up into the transmission and then bring up the pan with the fresh gasket. And did you know that the little bolts, the 13 that go around the pan, those are torqued to yield, so you should replace them. I just want to show you really quick. Look at down in there, the yellow element. That is the filter, because this is a filter. So even if you've been a good boy or girl and you've been doing your lifetime transmission fluid changes, it's still not going to be as clean as it should be if you don't do this part too. Likewise, I cleaned up the inside of the pan really nice, cleaned up the mating edge, and I have my fresh gasket ready to go. Definitely just make sure you buy the real one, this one that is metal with the rubber inside. There is technically a full rubber one that you can find out there. That's not real, your pan's gonna leak, make sure you get the real one. Final FYI, when you take down your filter, make sure it comes with your seal, and if you don't have it, go up there and get it with a little pick. Not too hard to pull it down. This is the old one. It is so hard. I'm squeezing this with all my hand power. Can't even make it bend. So it's definitely old and crusty, whereas the new one has some very obvious elasticity to it. So just make sure you get that done. Lube up the filter seal to help it slide up into place. Installing the filter is a bit unnerving because there's never a sound or something to feel that indicates that you are 100% seated. The replacement pan bolts were T40s, and the factory torque is quite low, around 2.5 Newton meters or 22 inch-pounds, plus 90 degrees, in the usual crisscross pattern of tightening. It's a new day and it's time to attempt to salvage this project for the weekend. I think I might be able to with the help of little things like this. So what we're gonna do is fill the transmission now. Now the pan is up, torque down, the drain plug is back in, the breather plug is back in, and my fill hole is open because we do need to use a specialty tool to fill it, or at least you're supposed to according to the workshop manual, which is what I'm gonna be following today. Now really on the upper side of the pan, there's a little spout and then there's 2 ports in it and they're facing sort of north-south, front and back of the car. And the whole idea is that you take something like this with a little hook in it and you hook it up into the port and just let it hang there, and it actually just pumps and shoots the fluid down into the pan. So the first step here, before we get into temperature related things, is I'm just gonna fill the pan. I know that I took out roughly, because I spilled it all over the floor, 4 liters. So I'm going to fill up the pan until it just overflows out of the spout. I'm gonna stop, I'm gonna put the fill plug back in, and then we're gonna get into VCDS. What you just saw there was me getting just shy of 3 liters of ATF into the transmission. Now I know I'm gonna have to add in more later, even though this is a fluid that expands when it gets warm, because ultimately there's lots of little solenoids up there. As you can probably tell now, it's a jungle of wiring and weird looking things up there that's gonna suck up more oil. So this is where we have to do the temperature check. Now, I'm gonna use Rostec in a second. There's a very easy way to show that measuring block. But realistically, even if you don't have another OBD2 reading tool that can give you a temperature readout for your transmission, I'll bet you anything you could probably just take an infrared gun and shoot the pan. And it's not gonna be a perfect 1-to-1 for temperature, but I bet you anything it'll get you in the ballpark and at least get you on the way of doing this proper procedure. In control modules, we will select auto trans and then advanced measuring values. Select ATF temperature from the values on the right, and now you've got a live temperature to monitor. Now here comes the important part where you're going to start your car and do a couple of gear selector changes while we watch that temperature reading. I'm going to show you everything directly from the workshop manual right now so you can follow it at home and you know that you're doing it the right way. See, not too hard, and you can tell if you know those instructions, you don't necessarily need to be using Rostec, which is great for everybody. Now, I actually did that procedure twice. I got up to about 25 degrees Celsius, and I could just tell based on what the transmission was sounding like when I was rowing through the gears, that it was sucking up fluid, and there was just no point for me to get all the way up to 35 because I knew I'd need more fluid. So I shut it down, went under, took off the cap, and a little bit of fluid came out. So don't get tricked. If you take that cap out and some fluid comes out, don't go, oh, it must be full. That's just what kind of gets splashed up on the bottom side of that cap. Dump it out, and I guarantee you can get more in. And I did. I was able to put in more than another full liter. So I got almost 4 back in, which is great. And then I closed it up, ran it all the way up to 35 degrees this time, shut her down, went under the car, pulled it again, and it did overflow properly this time. I could tell I was at the fill level at 35 degrees, and I just put it back up, and I am done. I've traveled back in time 3 days to give you a warning from hindsight that do not do this job unless you have access to reset your automatic transmission adaptations, either directly yourself through Rostec's VCDS system like I do, or if you can just go to a shop and get them to do it quickly for you. It is absolutely necessary, in my opinion, to do this to make sure that your transmission functions properly after a fluid change. The following is how you do the adaptation and what you need to do after you immediately start driving the car. Going back into the Auto Trans control module, this time go back to basic settings where you'll find an option for resetting of all adaptation values. Hit go, yes, and then the configuration will be reset. The following procedure is complete internet hearsay, but I did follow it and found it both practical to do, which is important, and effective. With the ATF temperature above 40 degrees Celsius, drive with light throttle, which if you really wanted to can be measured live in VCDS while you drive, and accelerate enough to require the transmission to cycle from first to fourth gear while shifting around 2000 RPM. Now coast and allow the transmission to take itself back down through the gears. In my experience, this activity took me from 0 kilometers per hour to 80 back to almost 0. When you arrive to a stop, hold the brake while still in drive for at least 7 seconds. In my case, I added a bit of load with throttle while on a brake stand. The remaining adaptation should occur during regular city driving. There's another driving procedure that was taken from ZF's website at some point in time and also wound up on a forum. This method is similar but contains additional and more complex road testing. If the previous adaptation method didn't work for you, you can reset your adaptations again and attempt the second method. And for the record, I did not do these steps personally. If you do not do this procedure, you're very likely to encounter a jerky type of transmission driving experience when you start driving your car after the fluid change. You're going to be slipping gears up and down the rev range. Things are going to be shifting at weird times. You're going to feel clunks. It's just not the way you want to do this. So I know that many of you will still tackle this and just do the fluid change and roll the dice and hopefully see those adaptations happen naturally over time. But I'm telling you, it's not going to feel right. Huge win. Look what I got at Canadian Tire today. They have a whole bunch of Dorman products. This one is actually pretty specific. It's an M12 by 1.5 thread pitch that you need for the center differential there. Now I don't have to worry about the parts counter being open Monday and trying to figure out where one might come from. I can actually just get this sorted today. Huge win. That is the hardest work behind me, thankfully. But as you can tell from the lack of sunlight coming through the windows, it's Sunday night, which means I have a long night ahead of me and I'm probably driving my wife to work in the morning. Anyways, got to forge ahead. There's lots of work to do. And that's going to be with the transmission brackets and mounts and inserts and all that good stuff coming now. It's really actually pretty easy. It's a lot of assembly. Again, I'm going to show you documentation that already exists online. I'll just point out a couple of things along the way. It's time to take your fresh mount and sandwich it back between its upper and lower brackets. Make sure that if you're installing the 034 mount, put the longer stud downwards, otherwise it will interfere with the transmission housing. And although it's hard to screw up, make sure the two extended bolt holes for the lower insert end up on the same side. Use your 13mm nut and secure it to 20 Newton meters on the bottom bracket, then flip the whole assembly over, put on the top bracket, but before you tighten down the second 13mm nut, run the two long triple square bolts all the way up through the bottom and into the holes in the top bracket. This will keep the assembly aligned and centered while you torque the nut. Mount up the assembly using the 10mm triple squares and torque them to 40 Newton meters, followed by the crossmember by loosely threading on the three nuts in the center. Now it's time to finesse the crossmember back up into place and torque down the four 12mm triple squares to 70 Newton meters. I found it was necessary to make slight adjustments to where it snugs up to the chassis based on keeping as much tension off the loosely connected transmission mount assembly. Minor changes of position of how all the parts are reassembled could mean a sort of preload is put on the rubber transmission bushing, which I wanted to avoid. After the crossmember was torqued down, I put the final 20 Newton meters of torque onto those three hex nuts on the mount assembly. Last, I put a little silicone grease on the inside of the 034 insert so it wouldn't bind with the rubber on the way in, added blue Loctite to the bolts, and torqued those down to 20 Newton meters as well. Man, mounting up that mount and insert and putting the crossmember up back around the transmission, so simple. If this is the only part of the project I had to do, it definitely would have been done Saturday. That's not the case though. We're deep into overtime and I still have one more thing to do up front, which is the ECS tuning X-brace. Now I mentioned I had a previous concern with the middle bolt holes on both sides not having full access for the extended ECS tuning bolts that were provided to pass through the control arm. It's not a problem. I just went under the car, test fit the brace, and they snug up just fine. In fact, the X-brace design is really nice. They obviously did some good scanning of the subframe and control arms down there because the middle holes actually are just the exact size of the bolt heads themselves. So they actually act as a bit of a locating and centering device, and it's gonna fit up really, really nice. This is what I mean right here. So center hole is exactly the size of the head. Rearward is also the same, but the front is slotted. So if you just need to maneuver a little bit, you absolutely have the freedom to do so. And look how badass this thing is. I could probably do pull-ups from under the car on this thing now. One thing I'm going to have to abandon today is what I was talking about at the beginning of the video. This is the P-clamp on the upper edge of the power steering cooler line. When I have some more time, I'll double back, give myself a little stud to connect to. And I'll fix it in the future, but it's pretty stiff for you A4 guys then. Just don't even worry about it for now. One small thing to be prepared for is you're going to not use a few of your quarter turn screws anymore on the belly pan, holding specifically where the transmission and the front belly pans meet together right in the middle. You're actually going to convert over into some little Allen headed bolts that thread into pre-drilled and threaded holes in the X-brace from ECS Tuning. And it's totally fine. It's actually really secure. And there's one more bolt in the middle, I think specifically for A4s that you'll have to use, but works out really nicely. Very final item that should be really quick before I can do a road test with the car. Rear differential fluid. Now, I'm actually not going to show you the process because if you've made it this far through the automatic transmission fluid change, you are more than capable of figuring this out. Truly, it's just plug on top, plug on bottom, just change the fluid. What I will talk about though is the fluid itself. For the rear differential, I'm going to be going with Liqui-Moly's Hypoid synthetic gear oil. This is a 75W90, which is the weight that you're going to be needing for specification back there. This particular one is nice because it's been formulated to adhere to both GL4 and GL5 specifications, so you don't really have to worry about what exact one you're picking off the shelf. I know I can always reach for this, and it's going to be good. For the record, I do use Liqui-Moly in all my oils in the car, and it always works really good. But also I tend to just try to stick to the factory manual when it has something really specific that it calls for, which is why we've been using ZF fluid and Audi's own fluid for the other two fluids in this video so far. But when it doesn't call for something specific, I reach for Liqui-Moly. This is great because it is not specifically for differentials, but definitely it is formulated correctly for it. Differentials experience a lot of shock. If you kind of think about how all the parts move in a car, everything essentially moves before it gets all the way back to the axles and the differential, and there's just a lot of pressure back there. So having a quality fluid is pretty important. Your car's only going to take about a liter in the back of it. There's a few different differentials that come in the B8 models, but it's going to take a liter or so. And I'm just going to pump this in using the same tool we've been using all day. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that. Real quick though, you know how I stopped calling out torque values of my fill and drain plugs? Yeah, I got kind of freaked out about that after I tore the head off that first one on the center diff. I just went back to Gutentight, and that was me just going until it felt just to the point where aluminum would start tearing or stretching, and I just stopped. So, you know, look up the real values if you want to, but I have a changed perspective on things like that. I did it. I'm done. I just went for a drive and there's no oil gushing out of the bottom. And I say that from retrospect. It's happened before. For all being really honest, everyone has screwed up majorly in the garage before. Now, when I went off on the drive, there were a couple of things I did notice and that I didn't. What I didn't feel the difference of at all was the X-brace from ECS Tuning. Now, don't get me wrong. The Avant is a big, sloppy wagon. I'm running the coilovers a little soft right now, so I don't expect a huge difference. But, you know, I did the car guy thing. I was warming up the F1 tires left and right, trying to feel some of that body roll and tightness, and it felt exactly the same. Maybe it is stiffening the chassis a little bit, but honestly, don't do that one if you're expecting a big change in performance. For me, it was just to replace the rusty OEM piece, and beyond that, just is what it is. What I absolutely did notice, though, was the trans mount and insert that I put in from 034 in two ways. One was good in the sense that the shifts felt a little crisper. I think if you read online, those are the sentiments that you'll hear. And I wouldn't actually say it's not like quicker, it's just the difference of feeling it versus not feeling it before. So a good example is when it shifts from second to third, and that slip is gone, by the way. When it does that, you just feel like a little thud because you're actually just like more connected to the transmission and the gearing that's happening in it. You just kind of feel more. So it gives you a bit more of that sporty feel, but I wouldn't exactly say the performance is mind-blowing. What I did notice, though, in a bit of a negative way was a rise in NVH. Now, 034 says that's going to happen, so it's not a surprise. But if you're just sitting in the car at idle, there's this little vibration there that just wasn't there before. So if you're doing this to a car that is your daily and you really want to keep the comfort maxed out, maybe skip that one. This part of the review, of course, is also coming from the future, but I do so from a place of honesty and transparency with you. Now, changing the fluids has made quite a big difference. There used to be a bit of a hum coming from the car. I thought maybe it was even the exhaust, which I always thought in the back of my mind was a little weird considering this is a base model A4 and why would it be that sporty? No, it was the drivetrain. So now that all the fluids are changed out, it's smooth, it's quiet, it's very comfortable. It's really brought the car back to a state where it probably was when it came from the factory. And that's sort of one thing to keep in mind here. Audi says that these fluids are lifetime, but they don't specify what the lifetime of that fluid actually is. Certainly it's not your entire ownership of the car until it hits the junkyard. So doing this is actually a great piece of maintenance. Also, that gear slipping that I was experiencing earlier, gone. 2-3, up, down, doesn't really matter. All the gears are really good. Nice, quick, little poppy shifts. And that is it. I'm gonna go take a shower. This was more work than I ever thought it would be. I hope you found some interest and learned something in this project, as somewhat benign as it may have been. This is the important stuff that we do to our daily vehicles. It's about maintaining them and keeping them on the road and not just shoveling money out to, dealerships all the time. You can do it yourself. Thank you so much for watching. Please give this video a like, throw me a subscribe if you haven't already, and I hope to see you next time.